Just to give you some background, so my my overall PhD, there you go, is on the EU's interregional policies with Latin America. So I'm looking at how this policy has been created in the first place, what was the rationale for the EU to undertake such a policy, and then how this has evolved over time. And specifically in this paper, I want to look at one aspect of the EU's attempts to deepen its relationship with Latin America, and that is the Andean community countries. I'll give you a bit of a background as to the overall interregional perspective of EU-Latin American relations, and then sort of delve into the aspects related to EU-Andean community relations. So as an overall background, this idea for the European Union to develop interregional ties, that means negotiating agreements of various kinds. Those can be trade agreements, those can be agreements on political cooperation or equivalent development policy, goes back to the 1990s, and that basically means for the European Union, or in the context of the European Union, that the European Union as a regional bloc, so not as a single state, but as a regional organization, aims to negotiate international agreements with other such organizations. Sometimes they're modeled on how European integration has worked, sometimes they're quite different, but that was the overall idea, that Latin America has a very dense network of regional organizations, and then in that context, this attempt of the European Union in the 1990s arose that any deepening of the relationship with the continent would occur along those interregional lines. So taking into account either existing regional organizations in Latin America or those that were being created or deepening within Latin America at that point in time and deepening those relationships. So the regional aspect is one important thing. The other is that the idea was to link different policy areas, so the main foreign policy areas of the European Union towards Latin America in one set of agreements. So they would be based on interregional relations, but also they would integrate trade aspects with aspects of development cooperation, as well as what the European Union calls political dialogue. So that's anything outside of those two policy realms. That could be agreements on cooperating within the realm of the United Nations, or certain other aspects such as the Latin American nuclear-free zone, and so on. The idea that was at the time that the EU would only negotiate agreements with regional organizations in Latin America that would encompass all three policy areas as one. So negotiations would always go forward in all three areas at the same time. And the first such agreement that was negotiated, and this is where there's a bit of an exception already, is the EU-Mexico Global Agreement from 2000, which has this link between the different policy areas, but it's obviously not linked to a regional organization. That is simply because Mexico does not fit into the Latin American context because of its NAFTA membership. So it's not linked with any of the other existing organizations in the region. And from that point forward, the EU has launched negotiations with various regional organizations in Latin America. And so it started out with negotiations with Mercosur and Chile after the conclusion of the Mexico agreement, or after it had negotiated, the negotiations had progressed quite some way. And then the next sort of set of negotiations that was started in 2007 were those with the Andean Community of Nations. So that at that point in time encompassed 4 countries, that's Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, as well as the Central American Integration System. So 2 regional organizations that, if you look at them, in many ways are quite similar. So in the way in which the institutions are structured in those 2 organizations, but also the economic level of development of some of these countries that we're looking at. And when these negotiations began between the European Union and those 2 organizations, they were being conducted exactly in parallel. So the initial mandate for those negotiations was passed on by the European Commission to the Council for approval on the same date. The Council approved them in parallel, and so on. And then over time we see something really odd developing. So where the aim was, for in both cases for the European Union, to develop such interregional agreements that would cover all of those 3 policy areas, that has only occurred in the case of Central America. So negotiations began in 2007, and by 2010 the agreement was signed with the Central American countries. And in the case of the Andean community, we see something completely different evolving. So we have a beginning of negotiations along those interregional lines. However, the outcome is quite different. So in the end, what happened is that moving away from this idea of concluding an agreement with the Andean community as a regional organization on the continent, we see an FTA being signed between the European Union, Colombia and Peru, and no progress being made on either the trade aspect or the political and development aspects with the other countries. So in the end, the outcome of those negotiations was a pure free trade agreement with 2 of the 4 countries in the Andean community, leaving aside the 2 other aspects of those negotiations. And then we have another really recent development where one of the countries that was left out of the free trade agreement initially, in 2014 signed on to this agreement. This is the case of Ecuador, which is quite a surprising development if you look at the developments, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that led to the breakdown of negotiations between the European Union and the regional organization as such. So 2014, Ecuador signs on to the agreement. This has not been ratified yet, so this is still very much in the making. But that's the sort of overall outlook of the development of the relationship with a specific regional actor. And before I get to the sort of background of the actual negotiations, I should mention a couple of factors that have been important for the EU and that I find coming up again and again for these different negotiations in Latin America that have an important impact on how these negotiations actually are coming along and how they actually end up being. So whether there's a success in the negotiations along the lines that were first envisioned, or whether we end up with something completely different, like those free trade agreements in those 2 cases. So the background factor first in Latin America is that the EU's approach towards Latin America and the choice to deepen its relationship is based on the fact that the continent became much more important economically throughout the 1990s. And that went along a process of further regional integration in the region itself. So any kind of regional organization that existed within Latin America deepened, and some others were equally formed at the time to try to sort of imitate some of the things that had been happening within the European Union. And that's the first background. That's the sort of Latin America becoming more important for Europe, becoming more important economically and as a trade actor in general. And then the second aspect is that we see within Latin America, despite the fact that these countries are getting more important economically, and that we see some consolidation of those countries, that we see quite diverging political trends. And the 2 regional organizations that I'm looking at in this paper, so primarily the Andean community, but then also as per comparison Central America, they're hit by the political developments in a very similar way. So we see on one side the election of governments that are very much in favor of a further opening up of Latin American markets, of a liberalization of the continent as such, and that is the case for countries like Colombia or Peru. And then on the other side, on the other hand, we see an exactly opposite development, which is the election of neo-socialist, neo-Marxist governments in some of those countries, the most famous one obviously being Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And we see similar political parties being elected in some of the countries that I'm looking at here. So in the case of the Andean community, in 2006, Evo Morales is elected in Bolivia, and then in 2007, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. So we have a sort of political split within the Andean community. That on one side we have 2 countries that are very keen on liberalization, on further opening up of their markets, and on the other side we have 2 countries who sign on to a different idea as to how international trade and international cooperation should work. So these countries start cooperating much more with Venezuela and different ideas as to how trade should function. So much more based on values. So they don't try to exchange commodities, but they have different exchanges of oil against doctors coming into the country and those kinds of things. So we have 2 very diverging trends in terms of what is happening in the region. And this is the Andean community, but we can see a similar trend in Central America as well, where some radical left-wing governments are elected and some governments are very much in favor of liberalization. And then the second aspect that's important for the EU's relationship with Latin America is obviously the sort of big other actor that's present in the region, that has always been present in the region. That is the United States. And we see sort of competition that's going on in terms of access to these countries and the markets of these countries. And this goes back to the example of Mexico and NAFTA, where the EU all of a sudden becomes very keen on signing an agreement with Mexico in the first place when it had signed on to NAFTA, fearing a loss of access in the country. And as a sort of background factor for what the United States are trying to do in Latin America, there is, at the time, so in the late 1990s, and this has led to deadlock by 2005, there has been the project for a so-called free trade area of the Americas, which would basically be a free trade agreement between the NAFTA countries plus all Latin American countries. That is very much a project of the United States, launched within the context of launched within the context of their idea of how Latin American integration and American integration as such should progress. So at the time when the EU first thought about negotiating any kind of agreement, deepening its relationship with the Andean community and Central America, this was very much an active proposal, and negotiations were underway between the United States and the other countries in Latin America. And then by 2005 we see a sort of standstill in these negotiations, but they've never been officially abandoned. So the project was still on the table, much like was the case in the negotiations between the European Union and Mercosur, which at some point sort of died down. They've never been officially abandoned. In fact, the Mercosur negotiations are now ongoing again. But this is a sort of an important other background factor to consider. So what is happening in the relationship between the United States and various Latin American countries, and how does that relate to the EU's approach to those countries in the region? And knowing these sort of two broad background factors, we can now actually look at these negotiations that are going on between the European Union and the Andean community and Central America as a sort of proxy. So what we see is that the actual start of negotiations with Latin America, so once again along interregional lines and sort of for a comprehensive agreement, begin in 2007 after a complete overhaul of the EU strategy towards free trade agreements. So 2006 is the year when the Global Europe paper is published, so we have a new trade commissioner who's very much interested in developing free trade more and in entering into new free trade agreements. And there was a sort of unofficial halt on any new kinds of agreements before that. So 2007, the EU undertakes negotiations with both regions, officially not for an FTA, but once again for this broad agreement. And these negotiations really get underway after various summit meetings between Latin America and the European Union. An important one is the 2006 Vienna summit, when proposals get concrete, and so by 2007 we see these official negotiations getting underway. As another sort of background information, these negotiations are embedded in existing agreements between the European Union and both regional organizations. So they're called the Political Dialogue and Cooperations Agreement from 2003, which basically already set up the development and political dialogue realm. So the critical factor of these negotiations, despite the fact that the EU is insisting that this is not the case, will be trade in any case. And in the case of Central America, the negotiations go relatively smoothly. So I already told you that they were concluded relatively quickly. And we do see some similar tendencies in Central America as in the Andean community. So we have some right-wing governments and left-wing governments, but what's really important here is that at every stage when these negotiations are about to break down because of political disagreements within this regional organization, the EU on its side just says, well, we're going to halt negotiations until you within the region, as regional actor, come to an agreement as to how you want to progress, and then we continue with those negotiations. And then in the end, the strategy of telling the various Central American countries that they would only ever come to an agreement with the European Union if they agreed as a regional bloc rather than as individual countries was successful as a sort of bargaining strategy on behalf of the EU. So there were attempts by various countries in Central America to shift from a regional approach to a sort of bilateral approach, whereby they would sign individual FTAs with the European Union, but the European Union very much insisted that this would not be the case, and in the end this was a successful approach for concluding the negotiations along the lines that were initially proposed by the European Union. So in the case of the Andean community, we see something very different happening. So by 2008, negotiations had entered into their fourth round, and from looking at various interviews and background documents, we can see that by 2008, so a year after negotiations had actually started, EU officials become really impatient with the progress in the negotiations, specifically stating that the countries of the Andean community don't seem to be in agreement as to what they actually want because of these background political factors. And by June of 2008, these voices had become even stronger. So there was open disagreement. Latin American ambassadors from two of the countries of the Andean community going to the press saying that negotiations would not continue unless the EU made important concessions, concluded that this free trade agreement, while being global, would necessarily have to include the fact that the four countries all had different levels of development, and at the same time linking this, and this perhaps links to the past presentation, linking this to a project being discussed in Brussels at the time, the so-called Returns Directive, and saying that they would not continue negotiating until the EU made important changes to this EU domestic piece of legislation. And at that point, the European Union negotiators actually say, well, we're going to stop the negotiations because clearly no progress can be made. And at that point in time, this was being interpreted by observers as something very similar to the negotiation with Central America, where the European Union said, well, we're going to stop these negotiations until you come to an agreement amongst yourself as to what you want from this agreement, and then we go back to the negotiation table. However, within 3 months, this position by the EU completely reversed. And when negotiations got underway again, there was no more talk on the side of the EU for an interregional agreement. There was no more talk about an agreement that would cover all policy aspects. However, the EU said, well, now we're going to negotiate an FTA, and we're going to negotiate that with as many of the 4 countries who are interested in negotiating such an agreement. And this is eventually what happened. So we see that at that point in time, Bolivia drops out of the negotiations altogether, citing its ideological discontent with free trade generally, and Ecuador follows very soon after seeing that the negotiations were going down a route that they couldn't agree with either. And in the end, we see these negotiations coming to fruition with Colombia and Peru only, so the 2 countries who are very much in favor of free trade at the time. And what's really interesting is that by looking at the documents that I had access to, it very much seems like it was Colombia and Peru who sort of coerced and convinced the EU into changing its approach. So the ambassadors have been very active in Brussels in lobbying the European Commission into changing its approach. And at the same time, we have to take into account that these countries were actively pursuing free trade agreements with the United States. So in 2009, one of the countries signs the first free trade agreement, and in 2012, the other country follows on. But negotiations in both cases have been ongoing. And the ambassadors basically took it to Brussels and said, well, we're negotiating this agreement with the United States. If you want to lose access to our market, that's fine. Otherwise, we want to negotiate with you bilaterally. So there was obviously, for those 2 countries, there was an interest in concluding agreements with the United States and with the European Union, so as to have diversified trade access to both markets. But the relationship here equally goes the other way around. So basically, both countries said, if you still want to have access to our markets, you're going to have to sign a free trade agreement with us bilaterally, rather than within the Andean community setting. And that seemed to be the end of the story. So 2010, these are signed. Then these are ratified over time, and they come into and they actually come into application. And then we see this really odd development of Ecuador actually signing on. This is something very recent that I've only recently started to look into. And here we see something very interesting. So in the case of the Colombia and Peru negotiations, we see that Colombia and Peru are the ones who are coercing the European Union into signing this agreement, this FTA. In the case of Ecuador, we now see something completely different happening, where it is the European Union that coerces Ecuador into the existing agreement with Colombia and Peru. So negotiations for the Ecuadorian accession to the existing FTA with Colombia and Peru started in 2013, And after a very brief period of negotiations, they're concluded by the summer of 2014, which is very short. In part, this is due to the fact that Ecuador didn't have a choice to modify the treaty. So when you look at the actual agreement that is being found, the text of that, there are very minor changes, and most of them are footnotes added by Ecuador as to the interpretation when some of the clauses would come into effect for the country. Another question is, how come that we see this change, despite the fact that there's no change of government in Ecuador, and that all the same reasons that the country used when it dropped out of the initial FTA negotiations are still present? So they still disagree with the overall approach, with what's in the treaty, and so on. And here we can really see that the European Union has used these other aspects of its policy to coerce Ecuador into joining this agreement. So Ecuador has been a beneficiary of the modified GSP scheme. It even got access to the GSP Plus scheme at the beginning of 2014, with the important caveat that the European Commission, basing this on its official assessment as to how the GSP scheme would work, that the country would drop out of the agreement by January 1st, 2015, because it had become a middle-income country. So this meant for Ecuador that it would completely lose access to the European market under these beneficial conditions. And the European Commission was very vocal about that. And here, luckily, we don't know who leaked a certain number of diplomatic cables between the Ecuadorian representation in Brussels and the Ecuadorian government. It might have been themselves. We see that in meetings between the European Commission, various EU ambassadors, and Ecuadorian officials, the EU is actively using this as a threat, saying that you're going to drop out of the GSP Plus scheme, you're going to drop out of the GSP scheme altogether, and your only way out of this is to sign on to this particular agreement that's already in place. And when Ecuadorian officials try to propose some modifications to the FTA, the Commission officials basically give them the choice, and this is sort of take it or leave it approach. So either you come into this agreement that we already have with Colombia or Peru, or you don't get anything else. So that's the sort of sticks that the EU is using in those negotiations. And quite interestingly, once these negotiations had concluded, we once again see move in other policy areas of the European Union. So a few days after the agreement was officially signed, the European Commission announces a new development aid package for Ecuador that would help the country in adapting to this free trade agreement. And equally, whereas the Commission had said beforehand that the GSP Plus scheme would have to end by the 1st of January 2015 because it couldn't qualify anymore as a medium-income country, all of a sudden a piece of legislation is passed that gives Ecuador GSP Plus-like access. So it is like GSP Plus, just that it's not a beneficiary of GSP Plus anymore, until the point in time when Ecuador actually joins into the free trade agreement. So there's very quick movement in these other policy fields of the European Union, just days after those negotiations conclude. And so to conclude, what we see here are some really interesting dynamics. On the one hand, when we look at the conclusion of the FTA with Colombia and Peru, we see those two countries using the fact that they had parallel FTA negotiations with the United States to coerce the European Union, or to at least make it more important for the European Union to conclude an FTA with them. Whereas then afterwards, in this period of Ecuador signing on, the European Union is using very similar arguments from its other policy areas to try and bring this country successfully into the existing FTA. So these are quite interesting dynamics. I don't exactly know what to make of that yet, and how that fits into the overall scheme of the EU's Latin American interregionalism policies. Those two negotiations nevertheless set a very interesting precedent for the EU. On one hand, moving out of this interregionalist approach that the EU still upholds up to today, at least rhetorically, in all kinds of official documents that we can see coming out of the Commission. And on the other hand, using some of its other policies, so primarily in the development realm, to try and promote its free trade agenda with Ecuador. All right.
Thank you.